Florence is generally considered the birthplace of modern opera. The Florentine Camerata was where the elite of the arts and nobility met from the 1570s onward with the goal of reviving the art of antiquity. The dominant secular art form of the 16th century was the madrigal, an elaborate polyphonic vocal piece. Because of its elaborate counterpoint and polyphony, text intelligibility was extremely poor. The Camerata wanted to overcome this flaw of the madrigal and create a new art form. The main focus was on promoting the textual intelligibility of vocal music. The motto was "Prima le parole, poi la musica." The aim were not elaborate melodies or gifted ideas, but a vocal style close to speech. From these efforts came the original form of opera. Jacopo Peri was its first creator. The first masterpiece was created in Mantua. At the court of the Duke, his music director Monteverdi wrote the opera L'Orfeo. Thanks to the genius of Claudio Monteverdi, this rather passionless vision developed into a drama per musica. The 30-year war weighed heavily in Europe, and it took years for the first theatre for the new genre of opera to be built in Venice. Monteverdi became chapel master of St. Mark's Cathedral in the Lagoon City. With L'Incoronazione di Poppea, he wrote the greatest masterpiece of the era and the first opera with castrati in the leading roles. Gradually, the art form spread, first in Naples and then to Northern Europe, where first the German Heinrich Schütz and later the Englishman Handel Purcell made a name for themselves with the new opera form. Henry Purcell was a musician employed by the king and composed for the famous choir of the Chapels Royal in St. James's Palace and for performances in Westminster Abbey. The piece you're listening to is from his opera Dido and Aeneas and is one of the great arias of opera literature. Aeneas has left the princess Dido. She's deathly sad and has decided to die by her own hand. This lament is written immensely effectively and is one of the handful of lamenti that can truly move listeners to tears. In the first half of the 16th century, opera had established itself as a new art form in Italy. From this genre, a special art form developed in France, the Tragédie lyrique. It was an Italian who is considered its founder. Jean-Baptiste Lully was brought to Paris at the age of 14 as a garçon de chambre to a noble house in Paris. He was a talented musician and a very good dancer, and at the age of 20 he met the 14-year-old future Sun King Louis XIV. Like Lully, Louis was also an avid dancer and a friendship developed between the two. Lully first made a name for himself composing ballet music and later composed popular comedies in collaboration with Molière. He secured the privilege of performing operas and then wrote the first operas, the so-called Tragédie lyrique. Because of the king's high standards for music, the Tragédie lyrique developed extensive artistic ambition, which required the use of great resources in order to provide the court with a great spectacle. French opera was fundamentally different from Italian opera. Italian arias were influenced by Belcanto, while French airs were more oriented to the ductus of speech. Chorus and ballad played an important role, and the Tragédie lyrique dispensed with the castrati, this role being taken by the so-called haut contre, a tenor with a very high pitch. With the death of Lully, the art form froze. Only the genius of Rameau was able to revive the Tragédie lyrique with the so-called opera ballet like Les Indes Galantes and the virtuoso orchestral pieces that populated his operas. A But by 1750 the time of the Tragédie lyrique was over. The increasing presence of Italian opera in France led to a dispute of the buffonists among Rousseau and laid the groundwork for the rise to power of Opera seria and Opera Comique in Paris. "130 years after the beginnings of opera in Florence, the art form had turned into a scenic and musical arbitrariness. It was now a high art form of the nobility who wanted to show off the virtue of the benevolent ruler with mythological material. That opera seria could become a powerful art form is due to three men. The Italian Metastasio reformed the poetry of opera seria and its librettos became the blueprint. He purified the plot and established fixed formulas. The opera now formed a constant sequence of recitative action and aria for contemplation. Its heroes were gods, knights and nobles. Roles and characters were stereotyped and virtue was always to triumph, the so-called lieto fine. No other librettist in the entire history of opera wrote more works set to music. The German Handel popularized opera seria. After 3 years of apprenticeship and travels in Italy, he decided to seek his fortune in London at his own risk. He opened his own theatre in Haymarket. To make it prosper, he used the star principle. He established castrati as primi uomini and coloratura soprana as prime donne to attract the nobility and the rich to his theatres. The castrati had the lungs of an adult man and the larynx and vocal cords of a child. Thanks to their amazing singing technique, they could sing incredibly long phrases with the most beautiful ornaments without interrupting them with their breath. The highlight was the aria di bravura, arranged as aria di capo to show their virtuosity with coloratura, cadences and tension. 20 years after Handel, it was finally Gluck's turn to reform opera seria and take it to a silver era. With his so-called reform operas, he tamed the stars. It was no longer hollow affectations, but noble emotions that should appeal to the opera goer. Under the protection of his former singing pupil Marie Antoinette, he introduced traditions of the Tragédie lyrique to the opera seria. To do so, he introduced the traditions of French Tragédie lyrique into the Italian opera seria. The orchestral sound became more colorful, secco recitatives disappeared and the importance of the chorus increased. Mozart was then in Paris and became acquainted with Gluck's new operas. Inspired by Gluck, he wrote 2 great opera seria and became the last great to write works for this genre. One of these operas was Idomeneo, which he himself considered one of his masterpieces. The opera buffa was the opera of the common people in the 18th century. It was based on the popular Commedia dell'arte and formed the contrast to the aristocratic opera seria in Italy. The most important work of this era is La Serva del Padrone, a 15-minute piece by Paisiello, which served as an intermezzo between 2 acts of an opera seria. The most respected composer of opera buffa was Domenico Cimarosa. His music was immensely popular and he was an European celebrity. The frenzy that Cimarosa caused in 1791, for example, with the premiere of his Matrimonio Segreto in Vienna was unimaginable. The comedy had to be repeated the same evening. In Italy, Rossini's comedies would have been unthinkable without the earlier opera buffa. In Austria, the works of Mozart were exposed to the influence of opera buffa through the Italian da Ponte. In France, opera buffa sparked the buffonist controversy in Paris between Italian and French opera. and in Germany, a direct line to opera buffa developed with the advent of the Singspiel. Even though works of this era are hardly performed today, their influence on the development of opera was considerable.
Der Hugelfänger bin ich ja, stets lustig, heiser Hopsasa, ich Hugelfänger.
Like the Italian opera buffa, the Singspiel existed in German-speaking countries from the beginning of the 18th century. The great era of this genre began when the Austrian emperor began to promote the Singspiel as a counterweight to Italian opera in 1776. It developed in an elaborate genre that attracted the best German-speaking composers. Thus, the princely opera houses opened up to this popular art. The first masterpiece was The Abduction from the Seraglio, which the emperor had personally inspired Mozart to compose. Less than 10 years later, Mozart had his magic flute follow. With Mozart, the Singspiel had developed into a mixed genre. While the fairy tale figure of Papageno sings popular songs, Mozart wrote the heaviest coloratura arias for the Queen of the Night and the purest Belcanto music for Pamina and Tamino. With the advent of early German Romanticism, the Biedermeier era, came the great age of the Singspiel. Der Freischütz was written in 1817 and, along with Wagner's Meistersinger von Nürnberg, is considered the quintessential German national opera. The famous chorus of hunters with the blaring horns became the epitome of German Romanticism. Only from a few operas have so many melodies entered into the lieder repertoire as from the Freischütz. In the lied Leise, leise, fromme Weise, Agathe intones a song that is among the most beautiful that German Romanticism has produced. The end of the second act of Freischütz occupies a special position. The so-called Wolfglen scene is a break from the conventional Singspiel. It lasts 20 minutes and has no dialogue. It was radically new at the time, and even today one is amazed how Weber has composed almost cinematic special effects in this scene. The climactic effect of the first ballad to the seventh has enormous suggestive power and influenced subsequent composers. Not least the Wolfsglen scene made a deep impression on Wagner. He called the two Singspiele, Der Freischütz and Fidelio, the two greatest inspirations for his music dramas. With the court music of the Tragédie lyrique, France had taken a special path in opera music. In addition, a popular opera comique had established itself, performed by itinerant theatre ensembles. They offered the common people entertaining fare, mostly spoken comedies with song interludes, so-called vaudeville. However, the French Revolution marked a turning point that had a significant influence on the development of French opera. The Jacobins wanted to shape the cultural world according to their own ideas, and it was Napoleon Bonaparte himself who recognized the theatrical world of the French capital by means of a theatrical decree. He distinguished between grand opera with ballad interludes and opera comique, and defined opera comique as follows: a comedy or drama mixed with verses, ariette or ensemble piece. Auber's opera Fra Diavolo became one of the first and biggest box office magnets. It was performed 900 times at the Opera Comique alone until 1907. The genre experienced its golden years from 1820 onwards, but the artistic content was rather mediocre. Eugène Scribe became a symbol of this. His writing workshop became the most important source for libretti, of which almost 500 were written. Scribe mainly combined sentimental intrigues with bourgeois themes and satires on his contemporaries. In the 1840s, Donizetti's La Fille du Régiment brought the Opera Comique to a great climax. 15 years later, competition from operetta caused the Opera Comique to struggle and it reoriented itself. It now became a genre of serious music, and the distinction between it and grand opera began to blur. By the time Meyerbeer died in 1864, the Opera Comique had replaced the grand opera as the leading genre of high art. Carmen, the main work of this era, appeared in 1876, but the beginning was difficult and the premiere even turned into a scandal. The character of Carmen was unique at the time, an indomitable woman, erotic, temperamental, and also a factory worker. She was also vulgar and rebellious instead of romantic and patient. In short, the exact opposite of what was expected of a woman's behavior in the late 19th century. The first act was still warmly received, but the longer the work lasted, the frostier the atmosphere in the large hall of the Opera Comique became. It was too much for the conservative audience. One critic wrote of the leading actress, "To see her swaying her hips like a filly at a stud farm in Cordoba, quelle vérité, mais quel scandale." Bizet suffered greatly as a result. On the night of the 31st performance, he died of his chronic heart condition. He couldn't experience the growing enthusiasm for his work. Many works from the Opera Comique have remained in the repertoire, such as Les Contes d'Hoffmann, Faust and Manon. Finally, it should be pointed out that the term opera comique refers not only to a genre, but also to a theatre. The second Salle Favart, which for a long time was the main theatre of the Opera Comique, and the premier theatre of Carmen, was the victim of a fire. The fire occurred in 1887 and cost the lives of around 100 people. Today's Opera Comique, the third Salle Favart, is a beautiful historic theatre and dates back to 1898. And has remained a French institution to this day. Italian opera was at a dead end at the end of the 18th century. The opera seria had run its course, castrati were out of fashion, and the popular opera buffa did not have their substance for further development. It took the genius of one man to raise Italian opera like a phoenix from the ashes. Gioachino Rossini succeeded in modernizing Italian opera on the foundation of Belcanto, and, together with Donizetti and Bellini, led Belcanto to its golden age. The opera L'Italiana in Algeri made the 20-year-old Rossini Italy's leading opera composer. Its music was novel, ravishing, and the ending of the first act may be considered the invention of slapstick comedy par excellence. This finale, with tempo increase, volume increase and virtuoso voice leading, became famous under the name Rossini Crescendo. Let us briefly look at the four main pillars of the vocal art of Belcanto with practical examples. Back to the history of Belcanto. With Rossini, the position of the artist changed. Composers were no longer employees of princes, but employees of impresarios who wanted to fill their theatres. To this end, Rossini established the coloratura mezzo-soprano as the star, replacing the castrato as the box office draw. Composers now wrote the arias into the throat of the prima donna. Names like Isabella Colbran, Giuditta Pasta, and Giulia Grisi are inseparable from the works of the three greats. Bellini's aria, Gasta Diva, became the emblem of the Belcanto era. An undulating 12/8 meter allows the singing voice the freedom of rubato. The voice floats above the orchestra and the singer can thus give the aria her imprint. Verdi spoke of Bellini's long melody, which requires perfect legato and long breath from the singer. The lyric tenor newly established itself as a second force alongside the prima donna. The new freedom of rubato became the singer's trademark. You are listening to the rubato in the aria Una furtiva lagrima by Donizetti. On November 21, 1831, a musical earthquake occurred in Paris that was to influence the musical development of the whole of Europe. The premiere of Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable caused a sensation. Frédéric Chopin witnessed the spectacle and wrote, "If ever splendor appeared in a theatre, I doubt that it ever reached the degree of splendor that is unfolded in Robert. It's a masterpiece. Meyerbeer had earned immortality." For this, the theatre used the novel gas-powered spotlight, and the ballet number Dance of the Nuns is considered the first ballet to be danced entirely on pointe. With this acrobatic attraction, Robert le Diable became a pioneer of classical ballet. Just 2 years later, the opera was on the repertoire in 40 cities. By 1840, 9 years later, almost 2,000 theatres had performed the piece. The Grand Opéra adopted the grandiose splendor and many forms of the tragédie lyrique, but opened itself up to the bourgeois public with historizing themes, spectacular stage effects, grand ballet, and catchy music. The production of the Grand Opéra required artists to create historical material with authentic coloring and political dynamite. When Auber's Liberty opera La Muette de Portici was performed in Brussels in a politically charged atmosphere, the riots that broke out after the opera performance triggered the Belgian Revolution and led to independence from the Dutch. The honor of the first great opera belonged to Auber, and Rossini brought the glory of Italian opera with his Guillaume Tell. But the composer Meyerbeer and the librettist Eugène Scribe became the undisputed kings of the genre. Many of their operas became box office hits, and Meyerbeer's death in 1864 was a severe blow to the Grand Opera. He died on the very day he had written the last bar of his new opera, L'Africaine. The Grand Opera frantically searched for a replacement and finally found the creator of the genre's most important work, Giuseppe Verdi. His Don Carlo is considered the crowning glory of Grand Opera. It was performed on the occasion of the 1867 World Exhibition. The effort required for the production was gigantic. For example, 350 costumes had to be seen. The performance venue was the large Salle Le Pelletier. It had room for 1,800 spectators and offered good acoustics. It was the Grand Opera's performance venue for almost 50 years. The building burned down in a gigantic fire in 1873. The Opera Garnier was built in its place in a record time of 2 years. Today, works from this era are rarely performed, as their length and the costs of staging them are prohibitive. What opera-goers heard on March 9, 1842 was unheard of. Giuseppe Verdi's opera Nabucco was performed for the first time in Milan. The listeners, who were used to the melodious sound of Belcanto, found the music of Nabucco to be pure noise. This work became the beacon of a new era. The era of the two opera giants, Richard Wagner and Giuseppe Verdi, began in these years, who shaped and dominated opera for the next 50 years. They took opera from the lyricism of the Singspiel and Belcanto to the high romantic drama. Verdi's compositional style built on many of the achievements of Belcanto. And yet, his style was new. The singers' roles became more dramatic, the choruses more important, and the music harder. The role of Abigail is exemplary to this development. Verdi is a romantic composer and does not stand above his art with classical restraint like Rossini. But is a participant, a person affected by the stories he sets to music. He consistently pursued the path of drama. 7 years after Nabucco, he created the role of Lady Macbeth and dared to break with Belcanto. The madness of Donizetti's Lucia was a mere breeze compared to the hysteria of Lady Macbeth. The Belcanto coloratura soprano became the dramatic soprano. Shortly afterwards, he wrote another music drama, Simon Boccanegra. Verdi was shocked to realize that the works did not find an audience. Verdi therefore continued to write popular number operas. The Trilogia Popolare, Rigoletto, Traviata and Trovatore was created within short space of time. These operas marked the replacement of the Belcanto lyric tenor by the spinto tenor. Verdi was a genius and a hard worker. 20 of his works are still regularly performed in opera houses and form the backbone of the operatic repertoire. His legacy was Othello, which he turned into a through-composed music drama. Wagner's starting point was the Singspiel. He himself named Fidelio and Freischütz as the basis of his opera. The influence of Grand Opera and the Belcanto should not be underestimated. Wagner appreciated Bellini's music, which he became thoroughly acquainted with as a conductor. Even Lohengrin, which he wrote at the age of 37, still breathes the Italian art of singing. But with the Flying Dutchman, he irrevocably embarked on the path of music drama, which he consistently developed further until he landed there with Tristan and Isolde. The backbone of his drama were the highly dramatic soprano, like Brunhilde and Isolde, and the Heldentenor roles like Siegfried, Tristan and Tannhäuser. The demands on the singers were so high that Wagner, for example, needed 6 years to find singers for his opera Tristan and Isolde. And he found the longed-for Tristan in the tenor Schnorr von Karolsfeld. Schnorr wowed the audience at the premiere in Munich, but died 8 days after the 4th performance at the age of 29. He had sung the 4th performance while ill and, according to contemporaries, died from the murderous role. More and more leitmotifs became the dominant compositional principle, until they became a narrative design principle in the ring. With Wagner, the orchestra experienced a hitherto unheard wealth of color, and his overtures, transformational music and new harmonies inspired several generations of composers. His life's work is undeniably gigantic. In addition to his greatness as a musician, he was also his own librettist. Wagner's music and his knightly sagas became the life's work of the Bavarian king Ludwig II, and they inspired him to build Neuschwanstein Castle. Ludwig became Wagner's greatest supporter, and with his help, Wagner succeeded in crowning his life's work. Wagner created his own theatre in Bayreuth and a festival for his work, which continues to this day. With the first festival in 1876, his vision came true and his ring became a Gesamtkunstwerk, the unification of the arts. No musician before or after him had as much influence on his successors as Richard Wagner. Mahler, Leoncavallo, d'Albert, Korgold, Strauss, Puccini, Saint-Saëns, Debussy, they all referred to the master. The premiere of the opera Cavalleria Rusticana in 1890 in Rome is one of the most surprising and greatest triumphs in the history of opera. The composer Mascagni had to step in front of the curtain 60 times, and the duration of the ovation roughly corresponded to the performance time of the one-act opera. This work established a musical verismo. Verismo combined realistic theatre with raw, emotional music. The plot of Cavalleria Rusticana, which takes place in a Sicilian village, has it all. Lola has betrayed her husband Alfio with the wine merchant Turiddu. Turiddu has dishonored Santuzza by sleeping with her without marrying her, and has thus made her a lawless woman. Santuzza denounces Turiddu to Alfio, which has evil consequences, and Alfio kills Turiddu in revenge. All of them became guilty. To reflect the violent stories of Verismo, music had to express violent passions and intense feelings. The genre is based on literary Verismo, which, with its pessimistic worldview, cast an unflattering spotlight on the lower social classes. There is no formal definition of musical Verismo, but in the second major work of Verismo, Pagliaccio, the composer Leoncavallo has Tonio say a characteristic phrase in the prologue. The people on stage are of flesh and blood. The text of the prologue became the program of Verismo. With Verismo, the foundation of Belcanto vocal technique was partially abandoned. Emotional outbursts and violence demanded a new style of singing. Passages like Pagliaccio's sobbing in Vesti la Giubba became the iconic gesture of Verismo. Rarely has the heat of the Vicino a te been achieved in a duet, where the two lovers await their execution in the face of the scaffold. Umberto Giordano wrote 140 bars of fervent music interspersed with ecstatic high notes. Puccini was the last romantic in the history of opera and became the creator of great emotions in the form of unforgettable female characters such as Butterfly, Mimi or Tosca. He drew his life energy and his professional work to a large extent from the great feelings of passion, which he sought in his real life in the many affairs he had. Puccini's music cannot be easily classified in terms of music history. He gave each opera its own signature, and he constantly developed his style. While he was never closer to his idol, Richard Wagner, as in Manon Lescaut, he was never more colorful and late romantic than in La Bohème. And if one compares Tosca with its predecessor, La Bohème, then one is amazed. In Tosca there is nothing left of the playful sweetness of La Bohème. Tosca was the opera closest to Verismo. It stands out with hard chords, dramatic duets, and a permanently tense atmosphere. With the famous Te Deum, Puccini offers us one of the most gripping mass scenes in opera history. Like Verdi, Puccini always remained committed to melody, and he wrote an astonishing number of immortal hits. Puccini maintained his creative energy until the end of his life. In his last opera, Turandot, he wrote 4 immortal arias. Among them is perhaps the most famous aria in the history of opera. Thus, Puccini became, together with Mozart and Verdi, the most performed opera composer in history. In 1905, Richard Strauss created an expressionist sound world with Salome that seemed to break with everything we had known up to that point. What was new about Salome? Strauss was an outspoken Wagnerian and further developed music drama on the basis of Wagner's work. With Salome, he established the most important aspects of late Romantic opera music, namely the expansion of tonality and the expansion of orchestral colors. The starting point for the late Romantics was Wagner's so-called Tristan harmony, which centered on the Tristan chord. It had first been heard 40 years earlier in the prelude to Tristan and Isolde. What was new about the chord was that its tonality is ambiguous without abandoning it. Everything remains in suspension. Playing with tonality now became a creative element. In Salome, for example, Strauss differentiated the character of the tonality by person. The music of Johanaan and the Nazarenes has a traditional diatonic basis. The music of Herod and the Jews is shrill and highly dissonant. The C-sharp major leitmotif of Salome is dissonant to the C major leitmotif of Johanaan, and thus describes the incompatibility of the constellation of the two characters. Strauss may have written the greatest ecstasy in opera history with the final song of Salome and the orchestral accompaniment. Ending with the famous dissonance on the sforzato and the subsequent C-sharp major resolution. The rest is swan song. Various composers of the late Romantic period cultivated an individual musical style, such as Janáček or Debussy, and thus remained individual cases in the history of music. Perhaps Korngold's Tote Stadt can be described as the last classical masterpiece of the late Romantic period. Like Mozart, Mendelssohn and Strauss, Korngold was regarded as a musical prodigy. In 1917, he conjured up the intoxication of late Romanticism one last time, narcotic in its opulence and melancholy. What came next had already been foreshadowed in 1909. Schönberg had composed the first atonal opera, Erwartung. He was the first opera composer to no longer fix harmonies and melodies to a basic tone. Strauss no longer followed this path. After the avant-garde Elektra, he wrote the nostalgic Rosenkavalier, which was Strauss' return to the 19th century. Otto Klemperer simply called it sugar water, and from then on Strauss was branded a conservative by the avant-garde. Schönberg's most important musical successor was Alban Berg. His Wozzeck became the most important opera work of modernism. He consistently utilized the stylistic devices of polytonality and atonality. This also changed the way the singers had to sing. His instructions were, "Do not sing under any circumstances." Not all composers subsequently wrote atonal music. Bert Brecht and Kurt Weill adopted the stylistic device of Sprechgesang, but used jazz music instead of atonality. The result was breathtaking, and the premiere of the three-penny opera became a sensation. The journey through opera history does not end in Europe. In 1935, Gershwin wrote Porgy and Bess, a work of world renown. The question of whether Porgy and Bess was an opera provoked controversial discussions. Gershwin himself called his work an American folk opera. He used operatic forms, such as the division into arias and composed recitatives, but also composed folk songs such as gospels and elements of the musical.